Naboaste, Wakainstein, Aikena Makuchin in Tangu Chebonto. Nagaha Gichimigichi, Tucha Wakain Kubne Usingi Abichin, Tucha Wasticha Nauchi Kemnasteka, Nagahana Chiniga Bonto. So I just want to say good evening to each and every one of you. In the Creator's eye, we are all related because we're all part of this world. We are human beings and we are of different color, but that doesn't make us any different. We are honored today, my wife and I, to share with you stories, thoughts, experiences, and all the wonderful things that are there for each and every one of us. One of the things that the old people always taught us is this. They said that you are a visitor in this world. And because you are a visitor in this world, you must learn from everything you see. You must learn from everything that you hear. And that is how we learn, and that is how we educate our mind and our heart. So hopefully with the stories that we're going to share with you and the experiences that we're going to share with you tonight will help you. And yes, we are looking for questions. Now I'd like to kind of speak a bit about myself. I was born on a reservation. My parents, the late Steve and Nancy Bearhead, were residential school survivors, but unfortunately they never got to a point where the TRC had begun. So they never had the opportunity to witness and to hear the stories of all the others that were affected by the same experience that they had that experience during the time in school. So sometimes I feel saddened by it, but I also feel encouraged by it because a lot of the survivors shared their story. I am very fortunate to be the one that could speak the Nakota language, Iskiabi, Yuspimakebi. So I credit my grandmother for taking that time and to be able to share the language with me. I am grateful for that reason, but at sometimes too I'm saddened because a lot of people are seeking to speak their language and having a difficult time to comprehend or to learn the language, to be able to express the things they want to express in their language. So for those ones, I feel for them because I know how I feel when I speak my language to other fluent speakers. And it's so wonderful. It's like music to our ears, and the words seem a lot more meaningful when we speak the language. So I just want to welcome you all in your different territories that you're at. And I'm hoping you have a wonderful day because it's been raining, but it's okay as well. So thank you. And Nina.
My name is Charlene Bearhead. We're happy to be joining you here from Treaty 6 territory, the shared territory of the Dene, Nakota, Cree, and Métis peoples in what is now referred to as Central Alberta. And really grateful that you're all taking the time to share and be with us from all the different territories that you're joining us from. As Jacob indicated, to me, one of the most important roles that I have, or probably the most important role that I have, is as a mother and a grandmother. And we all come with our own experiences and our own hopes for our children and our grandchildren. And I think and hope that our collective goal is to create a better environment in this country for all of our children, for there to be respect and understanding. And I think that once again, and I won't say we're living now in a time that's so important, because I think once again we find ourselves in a time that's so important. And sadly, we seem to, as human beings, need reminders over and over and over again about what happens when we aren't respectful to one another, when we are not kind to one another, when we don't acknowledge one another, and the gifts that are given to individuals, and that and we're really living in a time that there seems to be another reminder, or there seems to be a need for another reminder. So we were really honored to be invited to share some of our experiences. And I just want to say for myself anyway, that I am certainly not an expert in anything. I think it's always important to say I don't know anything. I think some things, I believe some things, I've experienced some things, but so have every one of you here. And we're just really honored to be able to share some of those things. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot in the work that both Wilson and I do in very different roles, in different capacities, but really it's around truth seeking. The way I see it is around us truth seeking, and all of us seeking truth, and not that we want to convince you of our truth, or I don't want to convince you of my truth, but that we create environments both in schools, in public dialogue, in community and families, where we can seek truth from many perspectives, acknowledge those things, respect those things, honor those things, and then be able to learn from one another, alongside one another. And for me, as someone who's always been in education, that's been missing in our Western education system. We know that residential schools were created to assimilate Indigenous children to Western Eurocentric ways. And I don't know that we're really that far off in our education systems even today. Children aren't forcibly removed from their homes and families, but we're still a long way from what I think we hope to, the point that we hope to get to, where we really recognize and value the Indigenous science and Western science, Indigenous health systems, Western health systems, Indigenous legal systems, so that we can really take the best of all of the knowledge that exists together on this land right now, in all these different territories on Turtle Island, and just really create positive relationship and respect and understanding, so that there can be healing not only between human beings in this country through the varied broken relationships, but also healing of the land, healing of the water, healing of all of those relationships. So I guess as we share some things, we'd really invite all of you to consider what that means to you. What does reconciliation mean to you? Is Indigenous voice important in your work, in your family, in your community? Why is that important? And so, as we said, Wilson and I come from very different backgrounds. And so we have very different perspectives and reasons. At the core, we have the same goals, but those experiences are very different. So I think one of the things we wanted to reflect on was why that's important to us, why the work that we do, why the opportunities that we're offered to help and contribute in some small way to reconciliation in this country. Mm-hmm. Is important. So
yes, it's there's a lot of in this country, there's a lot of opening of the mind and the heart and the spirit and those things. Now, I was sharing with Charlene. I said, growing up, I never had the opportunity to fully understand education, although education is a primary tool that we use to help people understand the world that we are visiting in. And so the stories that were told to me, I could never relate to them growing up as a child, because we never lived in buildings. We also didn't understand governments and certain things we didn't understand. And so when when I grew older, I started to realize that we have a lot of Indigenous books out there, a lot of authors, and there's a lot of children's books, a lot of novels that were written. There was also a lot of autobiography that was written, but there seemed to be something that was missing. And I'm glad that we come to this point where things are changing. And the reason why I say that is I'd like to thank the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for speaking and finding the answers for us to move forward together. I was at the event in Edmonton in 2014, and I had a big smile on my face on the last day because I remember standing there and I witnessed the acting premier of the province of Alberta giving his speech and his announcement, and that was to me, it was very exciting. I could just feel my heart pounding, and when they announced that in Alberta, all schools in Alberta were going to learn about the treaty, the Indian Act, and they're also going to learn about Indian residential school. So that allowed the school boards, the trustees, and teachers to find literature that they can teach to all kids. And so when I heard that news, it made me feel good because prior to 2014, there was, I'm assuming that there was very little literature incorporated into social studies, science, and those kind of topics. You know, there was always that one view that seemed to have taken over the minds of children. So I was very glad that education is going to be one of the tools that are going to be used. And I think stories are going to be another. And speakers are going to be another. So I think there's going to be opportunity to listen to all those things.
We hear often talk about language revitalization, the revitalization of Indigenous languages, and Wilson spoke about that a little bit in the beginning when he addressed you in the Nakota language. And that is so important. That's one of the harms that needs to be healed, is the loss of language. But I often think about, and working with educators and working in public education, think about how we use English or how we use French, depending on what our language is. But in our case, just the way we speak to one another, about one another, the way we write, the interpretation. Wilson talked about that early on when he said, when we speak to one another, one fluent speaker to another in Nakota, there's more meaning, there's a deeper meaning because we have a shared understanding of what that means. But when we think about the way language is used, the English language is used, especially in a very colonial setting, like an education system, like a university, like within governments, even something that you just heard Wilson say when he said, we didn't understand governments. But that doesn't mean that Indigenous people, Indigenous nations didn't understand governance. That the law, for example, we can think about the law. There were complex and continue to be complex legal systems, governance systems, systems of health and well-being, social structures, but they were so very different. And so it's not that Indigenous people didn't understand government or legal systems, but the understanding is so different. So when we think about Indigenous law and natural law, it's around relationship, and it's to govern, and it's rules about how we make sure that we share things, that everyone's taken care of, that we don't take too much, that we don't destroy the water, that things stay in balance. Where from a Western perspective, when we say the law or the legal system, we're talking about control and enforcement. And so I think just so important is just the conversations and the language and the dialogue to be able to share with people and take the time in those relationships, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's in conversations like this, or whether it's in the exploration of books and stories. You know, and the other thing when Wilson talked about, we didn't live in buildings. Well, people lived in structures. And I think back to when we were at one of the gatherings where Jesse Wente was speaking, and I loved when he shared that. I said, you know, as human beings, we think we're the strongest, and we think we're the smartest, we're most powerful, but we're actually the weakest. He said, and we were in a beautiful large building, and he said, we think that this makes us superior, but the animals don't need this to survive. We're the ones that need these things to help us survive. And I think back to our friend Hope Regenbald when she talks about her mother's experience in residential school. And one of the things that was so strange for her was just that she had never been in a place where her feet didn't touch the ground. And so if those are not our experiences and we don't take the time to share our experiences with one another, and again, whether that's talking to one another or reading about one another's experiences and sharing that, then we don't truly understand what that means when somebody says, I was scared to go up the stairs and walk on the second floor of a building because I thought it was going to crash. And people who have always lived in those sorts of structures would say, well, that's really silly. That's ridiculous. What does that mean? But if your feet have never been off the ground, what does that actually mean?
Very scary. Yeah, very scary. You know, to add to that, when we were getting education through sitting in a teepee, sitting in a circle, like a sharing circle, you can talk, you can interpret it as that. We were always taught at an early age that because we were visitors here, he said, Creator, Wakane, Creator, God, He made this land, and those are your relatives because they're the ones that are going to take care of you. They're going to help you. But we're also told that we, the human beings, were actually the weakest of all God's creation. We were told that because you're going to rely on the resources from the land to live. And as a result, it's true. You know, we utilize the mountains for spiritual relationship. The animals, they give us food and clothing. Yeah. And the trees and the plants in the forest, those ones are our doctors and nurses. They're the ones that take care of our health. And the water is what brings cleaning to us. So those are our relatives. And you know, so as human beings, I used to ask my grandmother, well, what do we do? How do we give back to these ones that help us so much? And she said, well, Creator said, in order to continue this relationship, you have to be very kind and respectful to everything that's around you. So I come to understand, and I come to learn that our people, I guess, were referred to as very nomadic. And if you look at it in a dictionary, nomadic means someone who owns nothing, someone who has no job, someone who just lives freely without having any consideration to anything. And so, but if you look at it from an Indigenous worldview, yes, they moved around. They might have 3 or 4 different camps in a year, and that's because they took in their heart and in their mind and in their spirit to look after the earth, look after the world, and they only lived in a certain spot and try to leave it as clean as possible the way they left it when they came. And so when other people come, they wouldn't realize that there was actually a camp here. So the nomadic term that was applied upon our people was something that I think needs to be corrected. You know, if you look at how we really need to look after the environment now, and I think that was one of the practices that the old people ensured that we do. There was always that story that was told over and over, so we can tell it to our grandkids as we got older. So those are some of the things that I like about the stories of the old people.
And I think as we speak, and I think you'll find this in your own conversations, that as people bring up one example, it reminds us of something else. And I think about the other term that I really struggle with is legends. That if depending on whose story it is, it's either truth or it's a legend. And so it's really interesting to me that if it's, in many cases, when we're talking about the stories, the teachings of Indigenous people, they're referred to as legends or myths, but when we talk about something, for example, the Bible, which also has stories that are spiritual, some people would call supernatural, whatever the case might be, but depending on who's telling the story, those are truths. And that we need to be clear that they're all teachings. They're all experiences, they're all sources of knowledge, and that needs to be applied regardless of whose story it is, whose teaching it is, who's telling it is. And so I think many of us can think back 3 years ago to 2017, and in the larger Canadian narrative, that was a big celebration year. It was a celebration of Canada 150. This country's 150 years old. I chose to call it Canada 150 plus 10,000 because I really struggled with, us espousing these great things that are happening. There's so much to celebrate, and I'm sure that every one of you here knew of people, heard stories where people were saying, what is there to celebrate? I felt like more accurately we could have called it Canada 150, 150 years of lessons learned the hard way. And what can we do differently based on, have we learned anything? As human beings, we seem to be slow learners. And so what have we learned? So I did not participate in much around Canada 150, and I'm not saying that it was bad if people did, but we all need to be true to ourselves. But there was one project that I was very excited about, and when I was approached to be participating in, and that was the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. And I was really thrilled to see that an organization that I've now come to work for, as you heard, I'm now the Director of Reconciliation, but I was not. I was at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation at the time. And it was really hopeful and exciting to me that an organization that had the word royal in the name, the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, decided that what they wanted to do for their Canada 150 commemoration project was an Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. And basically, the whole goal, which they achieved and did an incredible job, was around honoring and recognizing and making more public in a way that the Indigenous people of each territory chose to have it shared, to really raise the profile more broadly of Indigenous knowledge. And so the result was, and Jacob showed you one of the covers, was a 4-volume set that, and what I loved about it, and I think this is something that we can all learn from, is the process. That's what's really important, is that the First Nations determined what would be in the First Nation volume. The Métis Nation, Métis National Council and the Métis Nations decided what would be in the Métis volume. Inuit Tipiriat Kanatami and Inuit determined what would be in their volume. And so, as simple as it sounds, something so basic as to just have the respect to humble themselves and step back and say, we recognize that our strength is in the publication, in the design, in the collating and the editorial, but every single contributor in that process was an Indigenous person. And there were over 2,000, when we went direct and indirect, over 2,000 Indigenous voices.
That was great. I was very glad that this happened. And, I look at that 2014 gathering as a kind of a, the TRC gathering, and it was kind of a stepping stone or a milestone or an opportunity to move forward. So for me, I took on a position to work in in public schools, which was all non-Indigenous, mostly. But there was also people from different countries that were in the schools, and I got to learn about the history of the Ukrainians. I got to learn about the history of the Scottish, the Irish, the Englands, Rwanda, Somalia, Filipino, Chinese, Japanese, East Indian. So I got to meet a lot of kids that we came from that background. So in some situations, when I spoke to the kids, I always I always started off in a way that how my grandmother and them used to start off. They used to tell us that every human being was given a beautiful gift, a gift that came with them when they came to this world. And that gift is the ability to see. The things that we see are so meaningful to us. The relationships that we build through sight is so meaningful for us. And also the ability to hear things, because the things that we hear, we can remember, or in some cases, if you like a song, you can sing along, or even if somebody celebrates with you, whether it's your birthday or Christmas, the ears bring that. So my grandma used to tell me that when you speak to kids, children, he said, make sure you ask them if you can borrow their gifts that Creator gave them. So every school that I went to, the little ones, I always said, I recognize that each and every one of you have the gifts to come and be a part of this world and to be able to live a good life. So is it okay if I borrow your sight, your eyes, and I borrow your ears so I can tell you stories? And whether it's a kindergarten or whether it's grade 6 or grade 7, grade 8, they always felt very comfortable with that because I was honoring, speaking to them individually. And so because of that, whenever I went to did the story of song and dance in the schools, or whenever I told about a little bit about creation stories or in things like that, the kids would listen. And I remember this one young lady in Fort Saskatchewan Elementary, I think she was grade 4. And I was telling this story, this creation story. I was in it for 20 minutes. And this young boy walks in. And so I didn't want to exclude him, so I wanted him to learn too. So I stopped and I said, can I get someone to volunteer to retell this story that I've been telling? So this young girl jumps right up, big smile on her face, long black hair, and she jumps up and she stands beside me and she starts telling the story. She never missed a beat. For 20 minutes, the way I told that story, she told it exactly the same way. And I thought that was amazing. They were listening. And then over time, she's always complimented me and saying, Elder Wilson, the stories that you tell, they really mean a lot to me. I really get a lot out of it. So when I heard Dave Hancock announce that, what are we going to do? Or when I heard Murray Sinclair talk about that mountain that they brought us to and how we're going to climb that mountain together. And we have to find our way as a group, as an individual, on how we're going to climb that mountain, or maybe even help those that need to understand why they're going to climb the mountain. So I took that as an opportunity to educate myself and to be able to share with the kids what I thought was important for their early learning. And I felt that it was important too that we teach all kids, because we are in a country that's so beautiful. And I always told them that. I said, Canada is such a beautiful place. There's so many opportunities here. We have the opportunity to do whatever we want and to feel comfortable. And all of us, we have a responsibility to ensure that Canada is that place. It's almost like our own home, where when we invite visitors to come and sit, we have the food to give them. We have a place of comfort to give them. We have stories to share with them. And when they leave our home, they remember how they were treated. And so And I think when other people come to this country, if we continue that hospitality, uh, people will always remember Canada. People will always remember the opportunities. People will always remember the good things. So um, education has become a tool for me because I went to learn about all the Indigenous tribes in Canada, the different cultural practices, the different languages, the stories that came out of it. And I really loved listening to the elders wherever I went, whether it's East Coast, West Coast, or even here in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, all those places. I had an opportunity to listen to them. But as well, on my journey, I met a lot of wonderful teachers that came from various backgrounds, and we talked about how their grandparents were immigrated to this country and why they immigrated to this country and how they felt they needed to learn more about the things that are in this country. So I think when we education is a gift that's gonna bring peace of mind to our hearts and to our thought, but also to uplift our spirit because the old people say we just do tell you speak. Nor these so as we learn from one another, the gift that we are giving to one another is that right or that ability to uplift your spirit. And I think about that because that was one of my grandmother's teachings when I was a young boy. She said, you come here to visit in this world. And the most important thing in life is to look after your spirit, which is your nausea. And she said, your spirit came from the spirit world in heaven. And you came to visit here. And one day you're going to go back to that place. So during that time, you should look after your spirits, she used to always say. And so I took that to heart, and I really try and do my best every day to look after my spirit so I can help others. Mm. And so.
I think when we talk about the word teacher, and Wilson's talking a lot about teachers in schools, but the other reality is that the terms teacher and the term student may have also started to take on a different meaning. We have a different interpretation, maybe a broader interpretation than we did before the time of the TRC and before the time, that we're living in now. So we're all teachers, every one of us. We teach our children, we teach our grandchildren, we teach one another. But we also are all learning. And I would dare say that the average 9-year-old in this country today knows more about residential schools and the Indigenous people of the territory where they live than the average 50 or 60-year-old, basically because we all grew up in a time where that was not part of our education system. So we didn't have the benefit of that. So that was part of what brought us to write children's books.
That's right.
Because first of all, people don't, there's no need to be defensive or feel threatened, but it's difficult. It's hard for people to acknowledge or even wrap their head around the fact that what they thought was the truth, the facts that they learned in school were not maybe the facts after all, or it wasn't the whole truth, or it wasn't accurate history. So people are more open to learning and they feel less threatened, and we don't want to shame people. We want to bring people to the conversation. And so in our series, Siatu Skin Knows, there are 8 stories. And in each of the stories, Siatu Skin is the Nakota name for a little boy, Paul Wahasepa. And he's a little 11-year-old boy living in an urban setting that we don't name. It could be our city, it could be yours. His grandparents still live on the reserve. And so the truth seeking that's reflected in the books is very much like the truth seeking that we're all living right now. Non-Indigenous children, adults, families, communities are seeking truth and learning not just about the colonial history, but about the strength and the science and the knowledge and the knowledge that's been here since time immemorial. But so many Indigenous children and families are also seeking that truth for themselves again because of that colonial interference. So we've got a couple of, so this, oops, I've got the wrong one. Siatuskin knows, this one is called The Nature of Life. And I just want to read you a little excerpt where, so in this one, little Paul Wahasepa is out for a walk with his mother, Ina, and Ina in Nakota is mom. And she's teaching him the way she was taught. And they're out for a walk along the river. And some of the things that Wilson talks about that his grandmother taught him. This mother is teaching her son. And so she says to him, Michish means my son in Nakota. The rocks have lessons for us too, Michish. They are the ones that teach us to be strong, Ina told her son. Over the years, our people have suffered many hardships, but we're still here. When the black robes came, they couldn't understand our way of prayer. They interpreted our acknowledgement of the trees, the water, the four-legged ones, the winged ones, and all the natural world as heathen. Governments that imposed themselves on our people pushed us off our lands and outlawed our ways. For a long time, our ceremonies of honor and generosity were made illegal. It wasn't just our nation here, it was all across the land. Even ceremonies such as the potlatch of the Northwest Coast people, a ceremony that was about sharing what a family had, was against the colonial law. We already know about residential schools, and you know that back then, we would not even have been free to do what you and I are doing right now. You would be in a residential school learning all that you are not even allowed to call me Ina, and I would be at home with a broken heart worrying about you and Danny, but our people are strong and we're still here. And through the story, his mother takes him and some of the teachings that Wilson talked about. And so, although Wilson talks about books weren't originally the way, we've really endeavored to take that, I think, that storytelling and translate it into something that can be held.
Because stories are about taking us back in time. And the way the old people described it is that they're trying to use God's gifts to share stories of life. And stories are how to live in this world. And for example, one of them, they'll tell you what you have to do before you go hunting to get clothes and food. Because we needed the animal's skin to have winter clothes or teepees or those kind of things. And so they always told us stories and we listened. And sometimes they would speak for 3 hours. We'd sit in a teepee, but because their stories were so exciting, you know how they call it rising action, and it keeps going and going and going. And so that's how it was with the storytelling of the old people, you know. It got to a point where when they would say, well, it's time to go to bed, we'd say, no, we don't want to go to bed. We want to hear more, you know. And so that was really amazing. So we never did write stuff down. Everything had to be how well you were listening. And because you were listening, I think for our people, Indigenous people, or many others, like I can't just say us, but many others, kinship was very important. And if you showed a lot of respect for your grandmother, your grandfather, your aunties, your uncles, or your own parents, that meant a lot to them. You know, it made them feel so happy inside because you are graduating in life by listening and by seeing things, and that was so important. And so like my wife just mentioned that a lot of the stories in Sihatuskin relate to sharing of knowledge and through story.
And so some really positive feedback that I think that we've had as well is it's given opportunities in families for parents and grandparents to learn along with their children and their grandchildren, for teachers to learn with. So it's an invitation to that conversation. And another theme that really runs through, of course, because of the work that we do, is reconciliation. And what is that? Like, how do we define reconciliation? I think in a very sort of broader Canadian context, people think about reconciliation as the healing of relationships, broken relationships between government and Indigenous people, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. But we know that there's reconciliation and healing that needs to happen in every family. There's the reconciling with the loss of culture and identity, but there's also lots of healing and reconciliation that needs to happen in non-Indigenous families. There's a lot of fractured relationships around what is truth. And those conversations reconciliation is so much easier to do with people you're never going to see again. The tough part is having the conversations with family members and the people that are closest to you around beliefs that differ. And so one of the things that I think we both witnessed that's been really incredible in public education and also in education in schools is around the voice. And so again, I think back to the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada. It's been incredible to watch people on the giant floor map, where the giant floor map, that's the education component that goes with the 4-volume set. There are no provincial or territorial boundaries. It was all guided by original place names as much as possible around territories. And of course, there's territories between nations are not clear defined lines. People lived in different places for different reasons at different times of the year. So for example, Jasper, what's now called Jasper, 11 different First Nations have close connections to that particular territory. So of course they all have different names. So it's been really beautiful and really interesting to watch Indigenous and non-Indigenous people together on that map, for example, and people who have been very quiet in other gatherings are then, you see non-Indigenous people get on the map, and what do we look for to start with? We look for provincial territorial boundaries in capital cities, some sort of point of reference. So the conversations are really interesting as you see Indigenous people that say, well, this is where this is, and non-Indigenous people so excited and intrigued to have the opportunity for that learning that they haven't had before.
That's right. I mean, Jasper is a good example. You got 11 nations that go there. It all goes back to Creator's gift of medicine, healing. So there's a medicine that grows there that doesn't go anywhere else. So everybody comes and receives his gift. And so nobody's going to deny that. They're not going to say, well, did you make an appointment? Doctor will come and see you. Or one of the trees will come and talk to you. And then the plants, the nurses will come and bring you up to the doctor. It's totally different. So people respect that. So we got along for that reason, was for healing, because we know how important the gift of life is. I've witnessed that where when one of my family members, my father and my mother, when they went through hard times in a hospital, and us sitting outside in a waiting room, wondering if our loved one's going to come out that door, or we're never going to see them again. So we understand the importance of how medicine helps. So the people made sure that they left that gift open so other people can receive that gift for healing.
So I think we've also seen that in schools, and that's a real thread through our Sihattuskin stories. So I'm going to read you a little excerpt here from the offering of tobacco. And so we've endeavored to try to teach some really basic protocols too. When people ask, well, how do I go and talk to someone that's an elder or a community member? But we've tried to really weave that through stories, because in real life, well, I guess we do Google it, but mostly the things that we learn that are important in life are from our experiences. And so in this one, little Sihattuskin Paul Wasepa has to go back. He's called back to his classroom after school. And of course, like all of us who have been called back to class, he's walking and wondering, what did I do wrong? Am I in trouble? He's trying to think of what he's done. When he arrives, he says to his teacher, am I in trouble? As he says as he walked towards her chair. Not at all, said his teacher with a reassuring smile. I'm just hoping that you can help me out a bit. I'm getting ready to teach the new science curriculum, and I wanted to ask you about some things. And we're seeing these things happening
That's
in
right.
schools and communities now. Okay, Paul answered, a little bit confused. He was pretty good at science, but he had never been asked to help with the curriculum before. Many times when we're learning things in class, you have such interesting information to share. I often hear you talk about how you've learned these things from the people in your family. I think it would be awesome to have all of our students learn from your teachers, but I wanted to ask you first. Paul listened with interest. He still wasn't quite sure what Mrs. Baxter wanted his help for, but it sounded intriguing. Do you think it would be okay to ask your grandparents to come in and teach us some of the things that we should all know? Paul was surprised, but really excited. He was very aware that Mitashin and Magushin, his grandmother and grandfather, knew many things, but he was surprised that his teacher had figured that out. So we just wanted to share that little piece because we're really excited that that is something that's happening. And in the first book of the series, The Gifts of His People, it's really Paul just walking home with his dad after school one day and talking. He's starting out by saying, I'm supposed to bring something healthy, some healthy food to my class tomorrow. Everybody always wants me to bring bannock. Do you think bannock's healthy? And as the child, as they walk home, every example of buildings that he sees, transportation, medicines, people in the community, irrigation, that those are all rooted in different nations on Turtle Island.
That's right.
So I think we're aware. I just got an email from one of the people that we know that's in Toronto, and that's called dedication. We know that there are people in the east that are also joining us, and it's 11:15 there.
Singapore.
So yeah, Singapore.
That's right.
So we wanted to just say Ishnish Pinamat, thank you from deep in our hearts for joining us, for giving us the gift of your time, and just all of the things that you do that we don't know about. That are the fact that you're here tells us that it's important for you in the community. So I'll give the last word to the elder.
Thank you very much. My grandmother used to say that one day you're going to be telling stories and people are going to want to listen. That's why I'm teaching you these stories. So, and it's actually becoming real for me. And so I thank you for listening to us. From the bottom of my heart, and my wife, she's also thanks you for your kindness and the respect that you have given us in this last hour. The old people tell us that knowledge is meant to make us humble. So this knowledge that you've heard today, I'm sure it's going to make you humble, and you're going to want to learn more and become more knowledgeable. So have a good evening, have a good night, and we'll see you down the road. Thank you.